Hollywood once looked simple from the outside. The hero wore a badge, the saloon glowed warmly at night, and the unresolved tension between two characters felt like storytelling at its finest. For nearly 20 years, viewers watched Marshall Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty Russell exchange lingering glances and quiet conversations that seemed filled with affection held carefully in check. Millions believed they were witnessing one of television's great slow-burn romances. Letters poured in from fans, especially women, asking the same question again and again. Why don't they ever let Matt and Kitty truly be together? What audiences didn't know was that the silence they saw on screen was not always scripted. Behind the cameras, when the lights cooled and the applause disappeared, a different silence existed, one shaped by distance, pride, and an unspoken tension that grew heavier with each passing season. The story of James Arness and Amanda Blake was never the dramatic public feud tabloids might have loved. It was quieter, more complicated, and therefore harder to see. It lived in small moments: a glance avoided, a conversation cut short, a decision made in a producer's office that changed the emotional direction of an entire series. And because Gunsmoke had become one of television's most valuable properties, the network had every reason to keep those cracks invisible. When Amanda Blake first stepped onto the set in 1955, she carried the confidence of someone determined to change expectations. Western television at the time revolved around male heroes, with women often written as decorations or cautionary tales. Blake wanted something more. Miss Kitty Russell was meant to be witty, intelligent, and emotionally strong, not simply a background figure orbiting the Marshal. James Arness, already commanding in presence and freshly chosen for the role through the endorsement of John Wayne, approached his work with military seriousness shaped by his wartime experiences and lingering physical pain from injuries that never fully healed. Early accounts from crew members suggest that the partnership between the two began with mutual respect. Long shooting days often extended into additional rehearsal time. Conversations about scripts felt collaborative. There was laughter between takes, a sense that everyone was building something special together. The early chemistry that audiences adored wasn't fabricated. It grew naturally from two actors committed to making their world believable. As the show gained momentum, however, success altered the balance. Fan letters increasingly praised Miss Kitty's independence and charisma. Viewers connected with her in ways executives hadn't anticipated. CBS began featuring Blake more prominently in publicity materials, placing her beside Arness rather than slightly behind him. For many actors, this might have been a welcome sign of the show's growth, but insiders later suggested it subtly changed the atmosphere. Arness had been positioned as the unquestioned center of the series, the moral anchor around which everything turned. Suddenly, attention was being shared. It wasn't open hostility, but a shift that some crew members described as a tightening of energy whenever scripts gave Kitty greater emphasis. Blake's growing relationship with director Charles Marquis Warren, who occasionally expanded her dialogue or added moments that deepened her character, fueled quiet speculation that creative loyalties were dividing. Whether those perceptions were accurate or not, they became part of the set's atmosphere. An atmosphere can shape behavior even more powerfully than reality. One early moment frequently recalled by people involved in production occurred during a publicity shoot in 1958. Photographers asked Arness and Blake to stand closely, leaning into the romantic tension audiences loved. At the last second, Arness reportedly stepped back slightly, muttering a line suggesting the Marshal didn't need Kitty that much. Blake, professional as always, smiled through the moment, but those who observed it said something changed afterward. She later hinted to a journalist that acting intimacy was difficult when someone kept building fences. From that point on, the distance between them began to feel more intentional. On screen, it translated into tension fans interpreted as longing. Off-screen, it often felt like boundaries being drawn. By the early 1960s, Gunsmoke had grown into a television institution. Arness commanded one of the highest salaries on television and carried the weight of leading a cultural phenomenon. Blake, meanwhile, had become a symbol of female independence in a genre not known for it. Success did not ease tensions, it magnified them. Their acting styles diverged. Arness leaned toward understatement and restraint, believing emotion should remain controlled and contained. Blake favored subtle vulnerability, wanting Kitty to evolve with greater emotional depth. Scenes that once felt organic now required more negotiation. Crew members later described a sense of professionalism masking something colder. Two skilled actors delivering exactly what was required without the warmth that once existed. A physically demanding scene filmed during this period became the subject of years of quiet recollection. The script called for Matt Dillon to carry Kitty through a dangerous situation, requiring multiple takes under intense studio lights. Arness, whose old injury sometimes caused pain, refused to use a double. After one take, Blake requested another, reportedly feeling the emotional beat wasn't right. During the next attempt, she slipped and fell hard. The scream captured on camera sounded real enough that some people believed it wasn't acting. Production paused for days. Officially, the incident was attributed to fatigue, but those present remembered Arness walking away silently, jaw clenched, and Blake keeping her distance afterward. Whether blame existed or not almost didn't matter. The event deepened an already fragile dynamic. Schedules changed. Scenes involving both actors were planned more carefully. Physical contact became less common. Eye contact diminished unless absolutely necessary for the scene. Ironically, this restraint intensified the emotional atmosphere on screen. Fans praised the tension as romantic realism. Unaware it reflected real separation. One question persisted throughout the show's run. Why did Matt and Kitty never kiss? Writers occasionally proposed storylines, pushing the relationship toward romantic resolution. Each time, the idea quietly disappeared. Arness insisted that ambiguity preserved realism, arguing that the Marshal's character should remain restrained and emotionally guarded. Yet several insiders later suggested that deeper factors were at play. Allowing a romantic culmination might shift narrative power toward Kitty, confirming her equal importance in the show's mythology. For a series built around a singular hero, that possibility may have felt threatening. Blake reportedly advocated for moments that gave Kitty greater agency, including backstory elements that explored her past in ways unusual for television at the time. These ideas were often declined. Publicly, everything remained polite. Privately, frustration grew. By the mid-1960s, the divide extended beyond scripts. Crew members noticed that Arness and Blake rarely socialized together. They arrived separately, left separately, and interacted mostly when cameras demanded it. Even the show's social gatherings reflected the change. One year, both stars skipped the Christmas party entirely, each reportedly choosing different ways to spend the evening. The cast and crew joked about working in two separate versions of Gunsmoke, depending on which star you happen to be around. Yet despite this distance, neither actor allowed professionalism to slip. They delivered performances with such conviction that audiences sensed emotional complexity rather than strain. That paradox became the show's secret strength. Personal tension fueling believable storytelling without ever exploding publicly. As the 1970s arrived, Gunsmoke was no longer just a show, but an institution running on legacy. Both stars were older, and Blake began pushing more strongly for narrative changes that would give Kitty deeper humanity. She proposed a storyline revealing aspects of Kitty's past that would challenge audience assumptions and reflect a more realistic, flawed character. The idea was bold for its time, touching on themes of reinvention and survival. According to recollections from those involved, Arness opposed it strongly, arguing that such revelations might undermine the moral clarity surrounding Matt Dillon. Producers sided with Arness, and Blake reportedly felt devastated. To her, Kitty's evolution had been halted not for storytelling reasons, but to preserve a myth centered elsewhere. From then on, communication between the two reportedly narrowed further. Stagehands observed a near-choreographed avoidance, one actor entering from one side of the set as the other exited from the opposite side. Conversations remained polite, but brief. The emotional warmth fans imagined between Matt and Kitty existed almost exclusively within scenes. Off-camera, silence dominated. This period produced some of the show's most emotionally charged episodes, which viewers praised for their maturity and depth. Few realized that what looked like unresolved longing might actually reflect unresolved conflict. A confrontation during rehearsals in the early 1970s became a turning point often mentioned in later recollections. Accounts differ, but several sources remember Blake expressing frustration that Kitty had been pushed into invisibility. Arness reportedly responded calmly, suggesting that too much emotional complexity threatened the core of the show. The disagreement wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and therefore even more final. Those present sensed something irreversible had happened. The divide was no longer simply creative, it was philosophical. They were fighting over who defined the soul of Gunsmoke. When Amanda Blake eventually chose to leave the show, the decision surprised fans, but not those behind the scenes. The network attempted to persuade her to stay, but her mind appeared settled. Arness remained publicly silent, offering only restrained comments about the changing nature of television and the inevitability of actors moving on. Some interpreted his silence as indifference. Others believed it masked regret too private to express. The final scenes between Matt and Kitty carried an emotional weight that viewers praised without fully understanding. The goodbye felt real because in many ways it was. Crew members later recalled filming those moments with unusual quiet on set, as though everyone sensed the end of something larger than a television storyline. After Gunsmoke ended in 1975, Arness retreated from Hollywood life, preferring privacy and time away from constant attention. Blake pursued other interests and remained connected to many members of the crew, though she rarely spoke publicly about her relationship with Arness. Rumors persisted that years of tension might eventually soften with distance. A decade later, when plans emerged for a reunion film, both actors agreed to return. Blake reportedly accepted only after confirming Arness would participate, suggesting that despite everything, some thread still connected them. Their reunion scene carried remarkable emotional honesty. Observers noted subtle trembling in Arness's hands and genuine emotion in Blake's eyes. Lines delivered on camera felt uncomfortably real, as though the characters were speaking for the actors themselves. Yet once filming ended, they drifted apart again. The temporary warmth vanished back into professionalism. When Blake died in 1989, Arness did not attend the memorial service, choosing instead to send a brief note acknowledging her role in his life's work. Some viewed the gesture as cold. Others believed it reflected a man uncomfortable with public displays of emotion. Friends later suggested that Arness privately admitted they might have been too similar, both stubborn, guarded, unwilling to surrender control. In that interpretation, the feud was less about hatred and more about pride and fear. Two strong personalities protecting themselves until distance became permanent. Looking back, the story of James Arness and Amanda Blake resists simple conclusions. Their conflict, whether fueled by ego, misunderstanding, or differing artistic philosophies, undeniably shaped Gunsmoke. The emotional tension audiences adored may have been intensified by real-life distance. What felt like restrained romance on screen was sometimes the product of unspoken disagreement off-screen. Yet that same tension created something unforgettable. Millions believed in Matt and Kitty because the emotional stakes felt genuine. Perhaps authenticity often comes from imperfection rather than harmony. As years passed, biographers and former crew members continued piecing together memories, trying to understand whether the divide could ever have been healed. Some insisted the two respected each other deeply despite their differences. Others believed pride prevented reconciliation. Arness reportedly reflected late in life that they had both been trying to survive the pressures of a show that demanded constant perfection. The idea suggests a quieter truth. Maybe neither truly hated the other. Maybe they simply never learned how to bridge the space between them once it formed. What remains undeniable is that their story changed how audiences perceive television relationships. The unresolved nature of Matt and Kitty's connection became iconic precisely because it never resolved. Fans projected hope on his silence, interpreting restraint as romance. In reality, silence sometimes meant uncertainty, frustration, or unspoken emotion too complicated to name. The myth of their relationship endures because the truth behind it remains layered and human. Two actors, both proud, both talented, created something timeless while quietly struggling to share the same world. And perhaps that is the lasting irony of Gunsmoke. The bond that viewers celebrated for decades was built not on perfect harmony, but on tension that neither actor could entirely escape. Their differences shaped every glance, every hesitation, every unfinished sentence between Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty. What audiences saw as longing may have contained frustration. What felt like tenderness may have been restraint born from distance. Yet the result was unforgettable. Two people at odds created one of television's most enduring partnerships, proving that sometimes conflict, not comfort, gives stories their lasting power. In the years after Amanda Blake left the series, a strange quiet settled around the legacy of Gunsmoke. For audiences, the show continued to live on through reruns, frozen in time as a steady portrait of frontier justice and unresolved affection. But for those who had worked behind the scenes, the absence of Blake changed the atmosphere in ways that could not be hidden. The rhythm of production felt different, lighter in some ways, but also strangely hollow. Crew members later recalled that even though James Arness remained professionally committed, there was a subtle shift in his presence on set. He carried himself with the same calm authority, yet something seemed missing, an energy that had once challenged him, pushed him, and forced a constant negotiation of power. Without Kitty's presence, the balance of the world they had built felt altered, and viewers sensed it even if they couldn't explain why. Ratings held, but the emotional undertone that had defined the earlier years softened into something more predictable. The unresolved tension that fans once interpreted as romantic restraint had vanished, leaving behind a cleaner, but perhaps less alive, version of the story. Blake, meanwhile, rarely spoke openly about her departure. Friends said she carried mixed feelings, pride in what she had accomplished and sadness that her character had never been allowed to evolve as fully as she envisioned. She remained protective of the show's reputation, avoiding public criticism that might fuel headlines. Yet privately, she reportedly reflected on missed opportunities, wondering what might have happened if creative control had been shared differently. Some insiders believed she hoped time would soften the divide between her and Arness, though neither one appeared eager to reopen old conversations. Hollywood often rewards silence, and both actors had learned that lesson well. Their reputations remained intact precisely because they refused to feed speculation. The absence of public drama allowed fans to preserve the illusion that everything behind the scenes had been harmonious, even as whispers continued to circulate among those who had been there. As the late 1970s and early 1980s unfolded, nostalgia for classic television began growing. Networks realized that audiences longed for familiar characters, and reunion projects became increasingly attractive. Producers eventually approached Arness about returning to the role of Matt Dillon in a television movie that would revisit Dodge City years later. To many people's surprise, he agreed quickly. Some interpreted his decision as simple professionalism. Others wondered whether he felt unfinished business lingering beneath the surface. When Amanda Blake received her invitation, she hesitated. Friends said she weighed the emotional cost carefully, knowing that stepping back into that world meant stepping back in a complicated history. Her eventual acceptance came with one request: that her scenes with Arness be filmed early. It was a practical choice on paper, but those who knew the backstory understood it as emotional caution. The day they reunited on set carried an atmosphere thick with memory. Crew members who had worked with them decades earlier described a strange quiet, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something fragile. Arness greeted Blake politely, formal but warm enough to avoid discomfort. Blake, still sharp and graceful, attempted small conversation between takes. According to recollections, she asked him whether he ever missed the old days in Dodge City. His answer was brief, almost poetic, something about only missing it when it rained, suggesting nostalgia without vulnerability. For a fleeting moment, the distance between them seemed to soften. There was laughter during a rehearsal, subtle eye contact that hinted at familiarity rather than conflict. Yet when the cameras rolled, the emotional weight became undeniable. Lines written for the characters felt deeply personal, carrying echoes of years they never discussed openly. Observers noted that Arness's hands trembled slightly during one scene, and Blake's voice caught on a line that sounded less scripted than remembered. After filming wrapped, the fragile warmth faded again. They did not continue conversations beyond what was required. There were no public declarations of reconciliation, no dramatic hugs for the press. Instead, they returned to their separate lives, leaving behind a reunion performance that audiences praised for its authenticity without realizing how much of it may have come from real emotion resurfacing unexpectedly. The film succeeded, largely because viewers sensed something genuine in the interaction between Matt and Kitty, a mixture of longing, regret, and unfinished connection that felt almost too real to be fiction. As years passed, the narrative surrounding their relationship began shifting. Biographers, journalists, and former crew members offered conflicting interpretations. Some insisted Arness and Blake had simply been two strong personalities who struggled to share creative space. Others framed the tension as a quiet rivalry shaped by the pressures of fame and changing expectations in television. A few suggested that affection had existed but was buried beneath pride. Arness himself rarely addressed the subject directly. In interviews, he spoke respectfully of Blake's talent but avoided emotional detail. Blake, similarly, declined opportunities to revisit old conflicts publicly. Their silence allowed speculation to flourish, turning ordinary professional disagreements into myth. When Amanda Blake died in 1989 from complications related to AIDS, the news shocked many fans who remembered her as eternally vibrant. Arness did not attend the memorial service, a decision that sparked criticism from some observers who interpreted it as evidence of continued bitterness. Yet those close to him suggested a different explanation. Arness was known for extreme privacy and discomfort with public displays of grief. Instead of attending, he sent a written message acknowledging her as part of the best work of his life. The note was brief, restrained, and ambiguous, cold to some, deeply sincere to others. It reflected the emotional language he seemed most capable of using, measured, controlled, never fully revealing what lay beneath. In the years following Blake's death, Arness occasionally reflected privately on the complexity of their relationship. Friends later recounted comments suggesting regret rather than hostility. He reportedly admitted that they might have been too alike, both strong-willed, both protective of their own boundaries, both unwilling to surrender control. This interpretation reframed decades of speculation. Instead of a simple feud fueled by dislike, the story became one of two people whose similarities created friction they never learned how to navigate. Pride, once useful for survival in Hollywood, may have prevented vulnerability when it mattered most. Fans continued to romanticize Matt and Kitty's relationship, interpreting the character's restraint as proof of deep, enduring love. The reality behind the scenes remained far messier. Their connection on screen had indeed been real, but not necessarily romantic in the way audiences imagined. It was fueled by tension, disagreement, and the unspoken awareness that each actor represented a different vision for the show's future. Arness embodied stability and moral certainty, while Blake pushed for evolution and complexity. Their conflict mirrored broader changes happening in television itself as audiences began demanding richer, more layered characters. In that sense, their personal differences became part of a larger cultural shift. As reruns introduced new generations to Gunsmoke, myths surrounding the show only grew stronger. Viewers who watched decades later saw chemistry that felt timeless, unaware of the difficult history that may have helped create it. Critics and historians began arguing that the unresolved dynamic between Matt and Kitty was one of television's earliest examples of emotionally mature storytelling. Instead of rushing toward romance, the show sustained tension through subtle gestures and quiet moments. Ironically, what made it feel authentic may have been the real emotional complexity between the actors themselves. By the time James Arness approached the end of his life, public interest in behind-the-scenes stories had intensified. Biographers sought to uncover hidden truths, often interpreting silence as evidence of secrets too painful to reveal. Arness remained guarded, but occasionally offered reflections suggesting that the experience of making Gunsmoke had been both rewarding and exhausting. He acknowledged that creating believable relationships required emotional investment, and that long-running television could blur boundaries between character and actor in ways few people understood. One remark attributed to him suggested that surviving the world of Gunsmoke required constant negotiation of ego and vulnerability. It was perhaps the closest he ever came to describing his relationship with Blake honestly. Looking back, the story of James Arness and Amanda Blake resists definitive conclusions because it exists in shades rather than absolutes. They were not enemies in the dramatic sense, nor were they close friends hiding secret affection. They were professionals navigating a demanding environment while carrying personal insecurities and artistic convictions that sometimes collided. Their conflict was rarely explosive, which made it easier for outsiders to miss and harder for those involved to resolve. It lived in silence, subtle choices, and years of unspoken frustration. Yet that very complexity gave Gunsmoke something rare. The emotional tension audiences felt between Matt and Kitty carried authenticity that could not be manufactured. Every hesitation, every unfinished conversation, every glance filled with something unsaid reflected real human complexity. The show became richer precisely because harmony was never complete. In a way, their off-screen struggles contributed to the longevity of the story, creating emotional layers that viewers continued to analyze long after the final episode aired. The legacy they left behind is therefore both triumphant and bittersweet. Two actors at odds helped create one of television's most enduring relationships, proving that conflict does not always destroy art. Sometimes it deepens it. The unanswered question of whether they ever truly reconciled remains part of the myth. Perhaps they didn't need to. Their work together already spoke volumes, capturing the tension between connection and distance that defines so many real relationships. And maybe that is why audiences still return to Gunsmoke, because beneath the Western setting and familiar storylines lies something deeply human. Two people trying to understand each other without ever fully succeeding, yet creating something unforgettable in the process.